Hello and welcome to the Friendly Aussie Podcast.
So nice to be here, isn't it?
This is the Fab HQ. Look, Fab. Look at us. Yeah, fuck yeah. This podcast is about the upcoming referendum in New Zealand to legalise cannabis. Basically, we had a chat with the Make It Legal people.
Yeah. So Make It Legal is this organisation in New Zealand, basically one of the only organisations that's pushing for cannabis legalisation in the upcoming referendum, giving people basic insights on what it all means. Since the process of writing this bill in New Zealand in the Parliament was super rushed, they're only really voting on a draft version of the bill, so there's a lot of confusion. The Make It Legal team, they're answering questions all the time on Facebook. They've got a lot of people out there who are getting messages out to folks.
They're getting like 1 million people a week on Facebook, aren't they?
It's
like
great.
they're doing really well. They're doing God's work.
It's super cool to see what they're doing.
Sandra has completely, taken over this campaign, and she's a policymaker in New Zealand, which makes it really cool, I think. Having someone so involved.
In many ways, she understands the ins and outs of how to get stuff
done
happening. How do you change the existing framework? That's really what she's all about.
So
she's not even a drug user.
She doesn't use pot, so she's just a supporter of the cause because she thinks it's dumb that it's illegal. Enjoy the podcast. Stay blazed.
Yeah, stay blessed.
Welcome to the Friendly Aussie Podcast.
And so they're actually undermining the whole campaign because they're not going to vote for it because it's not perfect.
Right.
It's like idiots.
Right. Well, I think that's a little bit, I don't know. I feel like those people are a little bit fundamentally misled on the way that kind of progress and development in politics, in parliamentary politics is made. Because there's so many people writing these policies who, don't have direct first-hand experience with, a cannabis user or a medicinal user. And they don't understand how growing works in the broader context and how existing operations, illicit operations, could be transformed into legal operations that are regulated. And there's all of these aspects to the question of legalization that a bureaucrat that might not have that insight into those questions will simply answer for themselves. It'll be part of the bill. And then later on, you'll have people who have, once the bill is passed and legalized and everyone's voted yes, you'll have this situation where people be like, hey, that bill you passed when it's cannabis legalization has these problems. Because, people, actually give feedback to their representatives when something is wrong. So once that paradigm shift has happened, cannabis has been legalized, then it becomes about the ways in which the scheme is deficient. It doesn't become about whether we should keep it legal or not. It's legal. It's a bit like, that's a different question entirely, I'd say,
Yes, this is trying to educate people. We're trying to educate people in civics and how bills are made, how laws are made, as well as trying to educate them about why we should legalize cannabis.
Yeah, awesome.
No easy
Which is a big question. Yeah, big, huge thing.
And one of the things that people don't quite realize about the bill is that it's only a draft bill. So when we win the referendum, it doesn't become law. All that happens is it begins the parliamentary process through 3 stages of parliament and select committee and public consultation. So a lot of the little bits and pieces that people are unhappy about will be ironed out at that stage.
Cool.
Or at least hopefully.
Well, they will. It's kind of the process. The lawmaking process in New Zealand is pretty good, really. It's just that the bill at the moment, they wrote the bill, but they didn't have time to put it through that process. And so now people are actually just voting on whether to send it through that process.
Right.
But a lot of people don't realise that. They think that what the bill is in its final form, which is not what's going to happen.
Yeah.
I mean, for a long time, you had a situation where there was an announced referendum, but there was no draft bill, for ages, right? How long did that go for?
Well, the referendum was announced sort of pretty much straight after the last election 3 years ago in 2017. But the government at that time also announced that they were going to introduce a bill to legalise medicinal cannabis. And they gave that priority. So they actually spent the first 2 years developing that bill and putting that bill through Parliament and getting it passed and developing the regulations. And then it was kind of like almost, it was quite late in the piece when they went, oh hell, we need to put together a bill for this referendum that we promised our coalition partners. And so then they sort of, they actually worked quite hard to develop that bill, but they simply didn't have time to get it anywhere past a draft. So it was only April this year that we got a final bill to look at, to say this is what we're actually having a referendum on, which meant that there wasn't much time for the average person to get their head around what was in it. And we had this. We're having another referendum as well. There's the referendum on the end of life choice bill, euthanasia. And that one is binding. So that one's already been through the parliamentary process. So when that one is, if that one gets a yes vote, it comes into law. But the cannabis one is the opposite. We get a yes, it just starts the process. So you've got all these layers of confusion for the voter as to what's going to happen with the bill. We've been left to communicate that because the government hasn't done a very good job of communicating it.
That's
how did you
a monumental task
with this movement?
So I didn't quite catch it.
Oh. How did you get involved with this movement? Like, where did you find yourself to fit in?
Well, I suppose I have to go back to when I was about 11. I was 11 years old when my brother came home from being out one day and he'd been beaten up. And what had happened is the police had stopped him on the way home and they'd given him the bash and taken his cannabis off him. Rather than arresting him. And in hindsight, it's probably good that they didn't actually prosecute him for his little bit of cannabis, but that immediately made me stop trusting the police and be really concerned about police activities. And then when I sort of got a bit older, I joined Normal and I became quite active in Normal campaigning for civil rights. I don't actually use cannabis, and I never have. So I'm not somebody who's using cannabis and going, oh, I need to change the law for me. It was just from that young age, I was just really aware of the manifest unjustness of the law. And so the more I learned about the history of cannabis prohibition, the more I realized that this law just had to go. But I went off and did other campaigns for a long time. I've been involved in a lot of different civil rights and environmental activism. And when the referendum was announced, I went, oh, hey, look, I've got the skills here. I'm going to set up a campaign. So I rustled together a bunch of friends to start with, and then more and more people joined the campaign. And so then we set up Make It Legal. Make It Legal is a fully volunteer organisation. We're fully funded by donations that people either put into our bank account or through our Give a Little page. So small donations, $5 here, $20 there. Nobody's paid. And we were sort of predominantly setting up an on-the-ground campaign. We had people throughout the country, 14 different local groups who were doing stalls and events and talks. And then COVID-19 hit. We were totally unprepared, but we, at very short notice, shifted the entire campaign online, and we set up our social media activities. We're now the biggest social media presence of any of the referendum campaigns by a long shot. We have I think we're just coming up to 40,000 Facebook followers, which is pretty good, considering that if you go back to, say, May, I think we had like 8,000, not even 8,000, so we're growing fast. And we're getting our messages out to around 1 million people a week. We have a team of moderators who are working pretty much all the time, moderating comments. So we feel that a really powerful way to get people to understand the bill is to be available if they've got a question. So they can come to our Facebook site and say, what about this, what about that? And we will give them answers, and we'll post links to research and try and have those communications, those conversations with them. We have a lot of people who are in the middle of an argument with their mum, and then they'll pull up their Facebook page and go, Mum, read this, or my mum's asked this, what's the answer? And we've usually got someone there who can just give an answer. So that's around 5,000 comments a month that we're moderating and responding to. And remember, we're all volunteers doing this sort of on top of our day jobs and our families. So it's a mammoth undertaking, but we feel it's really valuable to get that information out. We don't think anyone else is actually getting information out as widely as we are.
No, you guys are doing really well. Like the branding and the questions that you guys ask and the questions you ask your community to ask. It's just really, really, really good stuff. It's what caught my eye. Are you in the digital marketing kind of background? That seems to kind of like.
I'm a policy analyst.
Wow.
And so for me, this is actually one of the things that it really grates across my nerves to see ineffective legislation and regulation that is not fit for purpose. So, the Misuse of Drugs Act 1975, which is about the same age as me, I look at that and I go, why haven't we reviewed this yet? It's kind of, so, I know I have no marketing background. If you scroll through our Facebook memes to right back at the beginning, you will see the evolution of our skill set there. You will see some really poorly made memes that were the first ones that I did a year ago when we the very first sort of Facebook attempts at memes. And we've now got some volunteers and other people on board who are much better at making memes than me. So we're not marketing specialists at all. We've got lawyers, we've got managers, we've got public servants, policy analysts. We've got all sorts of people who really are just kind of in other fields, but think that this law needs to be changed.
That's really, really beautiful. I had a very similar experience with when I first discovered a bit about cannabis laws, like when I was maybe 18, 19 years old, I started looking into the history of cannabis, and I started to see how unjust these laws were, and I was just starting to question it all. And then I watched, you seen The Union? It's the Canadian documentary where they talk about how communities are all involved in actually the growing of cannabis. And that just made, it connected a lot of dots for me as to why it's being so heavily policed and why it's all there. But for me, it was probably one of the biggest injustice sort of laws that I felt could change in an instant. And I was just, it was truly something that pushed me into the cannabis space, because I just don't understand why that it is like this. It doesn't inherently make sense. It helps so many people. It
really points out the power of propaganda. And how, because obviously these laws came in for other reasons, for, reasons that they wanted to persecute particular groups of people, or there was economic benefit to certain people or certain industries in keeping, cannabis prohibited. And they brought it in along with so much propaganda. And you've got this whole generation, in New Zealand in our referendum, there's a real generational divide. People over 65, only 30% of them are likely to vote yes. And if you go sort of people under 45, so 45 is the cutoff, that's when the Misuse of Drugs Act came in. So people under 45, 70% of them are likely to vote yes. But what you have is this older age group. They were the age group that were hit with the propaganda about cannabis, and for them it's not just a case of learning new information, it's a case of unlearning beliefs that they have held for their entire lives, and that's always a struggle for anyone to do that.
For sure, especially when their main information channels, their media channels, they're all coming from existing sources that are perpetuating those old wives' tales and lies about cannabis and hemp and its ability to contribute to the human species. There's a sense that, there's just a real, you kind of you are what you eat, but with information and with news, because people still tune into the Murdoch press and they're still getting that line that drugs are bad, that, people who want to legalize drugs are just druggies, basically. We have this thing in Australia where most of our print and TV media and most of the sources of information are just controlled in that way, and as soon as someone steps out of line, they're just mercilessly attacked. Just seems like that's the case in most Anglophonic countries, that there's this kind of dominance, this kind of media dominance by a few players who get to control the agenda, and they're in cahoots with the kind of ruling parties. And oh goodness, it becomes this kind of mess of associations and alliances of the elite. But these interests can only exist for so long when people get fed up with the basic realities. And, I think there's a lot of people in New Zealand like you that are campaigning really hard to make this thing get through, because it's an important reform. It's something that needed to be looked at fucking years, decades ago.
It is interesting. When we set up, we thought we were just going to be one little volunteer campaign and there'd be a whole lot of others.
Yeah, right.
But actually, it hasn't turned out that way. There's actually very few yes campaigns. There's the Drug Foundation have got Health Not Handcuffs. There's a few university students groups that are campaigning. But there's actually there's very little. We expected a lot more, and that might be because there's no one will fund the yes campaigns. The no campaigns can get money from the church, from pharmaceutical industries, from the alcohol industry. There's lots of people who have a vested interest in maintaining prohibition. But actually, there aren't those. Everyone thinks, there must be all these big business people lining up ready to give us money for a no campaign. But they're actually all really overcommitted because there's so many legalization campaigns happening around the world. There's so many countries legalizing that all of those businesses who might possibly benefit from it are already set up or doing something else where all their money is tied up. They're overcommitted, and they simply don't have the funding for little old New Zealand, which is actually quite a small market in the bigger frame of things.
For sure.
So there's hardly any campaigns active. We're probably the most visible because of our social media presence. The Drug Foundation's campaign, Health Not Handcuffs, is on TV and print, sort of more traditional media. But there's quite a difference. Health Not Handcuffs come from the approach that it should be a health-based approach to cannabis, whereas we are sort of different. If you take a health-based approach to cannabis legalization, that means that everyone who uses cannabis either becomes a victim of addiction or a patient needing medicine. Whereas in New Zealand, 90 to 95% of people who use cannabis do so with no ill effect. They aren't addicted. They aren't experiencing harm. They aren't necessarily a medicinal cannabis patient. Lots of people use cannabis simply because it's pleasurable to use. They enjoy it. And so if you take a purely health-based approach, you just totally ignore that majority of people. As soon as you frame it as that everyone's a victim, or everyone's a vulnerable person in some way, then your answer becomes quite different. Whereas if you approach it from, this is a pleasurable activity that adults are able to responsibly partake without any ill effect, and there is no good reason to stop them from enjoying themselves in their own homes, because that's what the bill provides for. It's only in your own home, it's not in public. So we take that approach, and that actually the majority of people who use cannabis are adults who are able to make their own decisions about what they want to consume in their body.
The majority of cannabis users would agree with you there, because I think it's nothing that there are so many ways in which that kind of approach of harm minimization and reduction, but in the frame of we need to make it either you're an addict or you're a medicinal user. That's incredibly harmful to people who are just regular cannabis users. And there's a sense that the medical establishment basically doesn't really understand cannabis. And it's making these massive, according to whom, these are things that need to be further understood in order to be really made these massive claims about, people can only ever be addicted to cannabis or have some kind of medicinal or sacred relationship to it. There's a variety of diversity of relationships that people have to cannabis. And it's more of a civil liberties issue when it comes to people being able to use this medicine, this plant, this herb in whatever way they choose. For as long as they're doing it in a way that is responsible and not harming other people.
Yes.
And it's really cool that there's this, acknowledgement globally, worldwide, throughout the consciousness that there's something going on here that is amiss and needs to change. That prohibition in the case of cannabis is, just as silly as it was in the case of alcohol in the US. And it has all of these ill side effects.
One of the things that I've found very interesting about this campaign is that effectively a referendum is a choice between two pieces of legislation. We're asking people to choose between the Misuse of Drugs Act 1975 and the Cannabis Legalization and Control Bill that has been proposed by government. And yet the debate, it's very difficult to get the debate to be balanced about that. Everyone wants to forensically examine the bill. No one's particularly interested in forensically examining the Misuse of Drugs Act 1975 to actually discuss, on any issue. So you might say, okay, some people have mental health issues if they are, abusing cannabis. Oh, how does the bill do that? How does the bill going to address that? And well, actually, what's the Misuse of Drugs Act doing about it now? Drugged driving. Some people get wasted and then drive a car. How will the bill stop that? Well, actually, how's prohibition stopping anyone doing that now? Young people are using cannabis. That's terrible. How will the bill stop it? Well, actually, how's prohibition stopping them doing that now? So we're constantly trying to get people to understand that actually we are not having a referendum on whether or not we like cannabis. We're not having a referendum on whether or not we should introduce cannabis to New Zealand. What we're doing is we're acknowledging that cannabis is here, and we're picking the most effective legislative and regulatory model for managing that cannabis that is in our society and is quite widespread. It's really boring. You can tell I'm a policy analyst, because for me, it's all about regulatory models, legislative effectiveness, how we can actually minimize harm while not unduly restricting people's freedoms.
For sure.
And it doesn't matter actually, whether you're talking about cannabis or dogs or methamphetamine or anything. We should always be evaluating our current legislation and regulation to go, how effective is this at meeting the aims and objectives of our society?
Totally.
And changing it if there is a robust evidence-based case for doing so, like there is for cannabis.
I think that there's something really important there, because as a policy analyst, that must just be second nature. But for a lot of people, even if they aren't going to get into such depth, that's something that subjectively, if they participated in it, they would be better at making decisions for themselves in relation to politics. And that would be, if everyone did that en masse, there would be a kind of broader guiding principle. It would be easier for people to make change in politics if they saw that that was possible, basically.
Maybe everyone needs to be a policy analyst.
Well, they just have to understand where they stand on issues, and it can be as simple as, for me, cannabis, I have people in my life who benefit from it, and I've had it a few times. I don't see the problem. So yes, but that's making up your own mind about an issue, and I think that that's becoming a more commonplace activity in a world where information is more decentralized and where discussions can be had by pretty much anyone at any time. The old kind of chokehold that existed on public opinion is beginning to fall apart. So even if we don't get it this time, which I would be devastated if that happened, I think that there's a broader trend that's leading towards people recognizing how bullshit some things are, and that they don't have to just recognize, they don't have to just accept that it is the way that it is, that it isn't going to change.
Yeah. And all over the world, countries are changing their prohibition laws because the evidence is so overwhelmingly clear that prohibition is an ineffective way to manage people's behavior. And it doesn't work for sex, it doesn't work for cannabis, it doesn't work for anything. Just telling people you shouldn't do it. It's just challenging. I think that there are a lot of issues where there is the over 65 voter bloc who are extraordinarily conservative and unwilling to change long-held views. They are holding back a lot of progressive issues, not just drug law reform, but a lot of environmental issues and other issues. And so I think that what we're going to do is probably in the next over the next 6 years or so, the next couple of election cycles, basically, you'll start getting those younger voters actually voting. And then finally, we will have a voter bloc bigger than that old voter bloc. We will start to vote some of these things, these sensible, progressive changes through.
to me, COVID's like allowed everyone to retreat, come within themselves, and kind of discover new things about themselves because now they've had time to do it. And you've also got the ability that, well, not ability, but more COVID's causing death in the older crowd. So I think that's kind of, to me, COVID's a balancing act of the world at the moment. Either we've had like, I don't know if people are supposed to live for 100, 120 years. Maybe that's like not a thing that should be a thing. It's just happened that way. But as a result, that's definitely stopped human progression for maybe the last 20 or 30 years. It doesn't feel like we've moved much further in terms of social things, apart some bigger, broader social issues like domestic violence, gay rights, and that sort of stuff. But as a whole, I don't think we've really changed how humanity sees the world and how we should really be working together to kind of grow out the world rather than fight on an individual basis.
I agree with you. As someone that is involved in multiple activist issues, you know, not just cannabis, you know, sometimes it seems like you're just smashing your head against a brick wall waiting for some of those changes to occur.
Yeah, and a lot of it is really structural. Like you're a human being, an individual, but these big things that you're dealing with, they affect so many people, and they're dynamics that have existed well before us. And we'll, you know, it's something that has this kind of like magnitude to it. So I don't know. At the end of the day, when we're working in relation to it, I guess sometimes the thing that I get annoyed with is the kind of propaganda that gets spread about politics in general. Like certain issues, they're on the table, but other issues, you get like a slap on the wrist for talking about them, and it's stigmatized. Yes. Cannabis is one of those issues. It's considered, it's not important. You don't need to worry about it. It's like, it's weird that you're even considering it, like, you know, that kind of thing. But even when you're talking about, like, I think Yossip's right when he talks about past 20, 30, 40 years of just kind of corporate neoliberal dominance, where essentially you don't really get to talk about anything fundamental or rootsy or structural. You only get to talk about surface level reforms. Anything related to the economy, by God, no, that is a machine, that is a mechanism, that is a technocratic thing that does it's actually like an artificial intelligence that we don't have control over. So don't worry about that. It's like actually just a system that is doing its own thing, and it's in control of the human species. So don't worry about that, right? Like, just do what the market says. And if the line goes up, that's good. If the line goes down, that's bad. So don't make the line go down. And the way that you make the line go up is you just do what the shareholders say. So just do what the shareholders say. You'll be fine. It's okay. Like, that's basically the system that we've lived in for the past 30 or 40 years. Anything that the politicians do is just about protecting the invested interests. Like, it's nothing more than that. And the reason why cannabis gets in the way and why it hasn't been legalized is because there are so many financial and economic interests that are just like standing in the way of something that makes sense.
It's interesting because the no vote over here in New Zealand, if you go and have a look at who they are, they include, for example, people who run drug testing companies. You know, and things like that. And then when I go and do talks, people say to me, "Oh, who are you being paid by? You must be getting paid by big cannabis." And I'm like, there is no big cannabis, okay? It doesn't exist in New Zealand. But the alcohol industry, the pharmaceutical industry, the drug testing industry, and the church, they all have a vested interest in keeping prohibition, okay? So, but they're very ready to accuse me of having a vested interest without stopping to think about the vested interest that is, that prohibition supports. So it's an interesting scenario to constantly be being accused of, I don't know, being immoral. I'd love it if somebody was paying me to do this. It'd be great. I wouldn't have to do my full-time job as well as doing all of this. Wouldn't that be nice? Wow.
We need a billionaire who smokes weed.
Yeah, I know.
Really wants it legal in New Zealand because he has like a millionaire mansion. You know how those billionaires have mansions in New Zealand?
Yes.
Yeah, he's one of those.
That'd be great. Wouldn't it be nice?
I don't understand, because I just see so much industry and economic benefit from legalization as well. And
well, there's that. But that's competition. Think about it. You're fighting against the future.
I don't know. It should generate wealth, really.
I mean, it should, but the thing about it, it's not their wealth. They have old wealth. New wealth being created in new industries means new startup people who,
They've got money.
like the thing about it is, man,
Industry.
you can do that. You can do that. But why would you do that when you are already a pharmaceutical giant and you have total dominance over those industries? You don't have total dominance over the cannabis industry. So it's just hedging your bets. And it's the same thing with climate change and fossil fuels. So they will actually say, like, well, what lobby are you funded by? The climate, the environmental council or something? But like, what is all of the anti-science agenda? What is all of the, papers that come out that say climate change is fake? You look into every single one of those papers, every single one of those reports, and they're all fucking funded by the oil, gas, coal lobby, by the mining councils, by the existing hedged interests. And that's exactly what's happening here. It's the same thing.
Power is held by the people who currently have accumulated wealth, and they want to keep their accumulated wealth, and so therefore they have to stop anyone else coming over and taking it off them. So therefore they have to suppress anything new, and the cannabis industry is a new industry that will particularly affect the pharmaceutical and alcohol industries, who will suffer in,
I don't think alcohol would suffer as much as people think, to be honest. I really don't think so. I think alcohol would actually stay very stable.
There might be some people who drink less and are less binge drinky.
The thing is, the alcohol industry has evolved because of cannabis. I don't know if you've thought about this, but like, do you guys in New Zealand have a lot of craft beers now coming through?
Yeah.
Yeah, think about that in terms of cannabis. So cannabis has strains and different varieties. And then in the US, they started packaging them really interestingly, like comic book style or cartoony. And now you have these brewing companies doing the same with craft beer. They're putting them in nice fancy cans and remarketing them and saying, oh, it's got these flavors and this. That was cannabis. They literally took it from cannabis and applied it to alcohol. And I'm like, that's growing that market heavily. We're moving to a world where it's all artisan craft is what we're wanting.
The cannabis bill that we've got over here has already sort of predicated that, and that the bill has an aspect of it which is micro cultivators, and they can get cheaper licenses. So the government has structured a bill to try and make it that our cannabis market would be predominantly small to medium niche businesses with local production and local distribution. There's no vertical alignment allowed, so you can't hold a license to both grow and sell, and no one is allowed to hold more than 20% of the market. And these are all designed to try and avoid having a large corporate sort of cannabis market, and to try and make sure that it's small and niche. Now, the other thing they've done is they've made that you're not allowed to sell alcohol and cannabis in the same place. So and this is sort of cut, and you're not allowed to have products that include alcohol and cannabis. So you can't have cannabis infused beer or wine or something like that. And so they've really tried to separate the alcohol market out from the cannabis market, which isn't really a way to bring the alcohol industry on board. So they've got those sorts of things. But what they really want is all our current illicit growers to become legal, get a micro cultivation license, and continue what they're doing legally.
That would be honestly exactly the way I would think it should be done, because then you've effectively just legalized that market and they can just come to the table. It can be done so quickly. You're now going to get clean money, but the only problem there is they're going to be like, well, they were now criminals at that stage, and now if they come out of hiding, what happens if a bill got flipped and suddenly you have all these growers that came out and now you know who they are and you're like, well, time to clean up. And I think that's where a huge fear could be. Like, where do you have the trust?
Yeah,
no one trusts government.
We certainly come across that. If you think about the people who you'd think would be supportive of the bill going through, we have an entire movement of people who are pro-cannabis, anti-referendum, because they're saying, well, I'm already growing it and selling it, you're going to take my market off me. Or alternatively, you're just trying to find out who uses cannabis so that the police can go and bust them after the referendum. And we've got a world at the moment where anti-government conspiracy theorists, it's a really popular thing to be at the moment. So you throw that at a government referendum. And I'm constantly saying to people, if this was a government conspiracy, they wouldn't be having a referendum. They would have just legalized it. Okay, they wouldn't be leaving this to people like me to try and win this referendum. This is not a government conspiracy. This is the government doing something that they really, really don't want to do. And so they're just giving it no oxygen. And if we win, it will be despite the government, certainly not because the government has done anything to help us.
I have to think about, do these people want to be taxed on what they're growing? You know, that's a big thing. There's a lot of money that's off the table as soon as you legalize.
We spoke to Dr. Eric Crampton, who's the chief economist at the New Zealand Institute. So that's a right-wing think tank. And we sort of said to him, okay, well, can you explain to us the economics of a legal market compared to an illicit market? And he said that that people need to understand that growing cannabis legally is much cheaper, about 25% cheaper than growing cannabis illegally.
Mm.
So the price, and what the taxation system is designed to fill that gap again. So the idea is to keep the legal weed at about the same price as the illegal. Okay, so that you don't want people to suddenly go crazy and start using more. Okay, so you don't want it to get really cheap, but at the same time you want to raise the taxes. So they've got that tax will be, and they've got an authority whose role it is to moderate that, to keep the legal cannabis prices at a level that will encourage people to leave the illicit market and become legal, but won't encourage people to increase their cannabis use. So because they've got multiple aims of the bill. One of them is to reduce the illicit market, and the other one is to avoid having an increase in the amount of cannabis that people are using. So they're trying to sort of get this bit of a balance going between the two. And the taxes and levies, they've got harm minimisation levies, which will be ring-fenced to pay for drug education, public health messaging, mental health and addiction services. So overall, I think that the tax will be fine as long as they... there is a risk that a future government will see it a bit much as a honeypot and start wanting to raid it. But overall, the aims are there, and it's in the hands of a regulatory authority, not actually directly under the control of the government.
It's better than how Canada's implemented it. Canada has a big problem with the black market still existing maybe 7 times more than the legal market. I think the legal market brought in only about $1 billion or so, while the illicit market brought in about 7.
And this will have been because of policy decisions they made to lock people out of the legal market, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, that's particularly why with the New Zealand bill, they've tried really hard to bring the illegal growers in, and they'll end up dobbing each other. And once some of them are legal, they'll dob in the illegal ones. But I think more importantly, with the whole thing, Canada has only been going for 18 months, coming up to 2 years now. Okay, if you think about alcohol prohibition in the US, it took 50 years before the legal market for alcohol was the main market. Like even now, there are still moonshiners in America. You don't, even if you've got legal markets, if I was selling cars or something like that, it would take me a really long time to break into a market and gain market share and win customers over to my product. And it's no different. It doesn't matter whether the market's legal or illegal. It actually just takes time to win a customer base, to win that loyalty.
Sure.
So you can't.
And part of it is,
you can't expect it to happen overnight.
You'd have to think that, part of the process of legalizing and creating a legal market is also decriminalizing the activity that is occurring in a lot of the illegal markets. So it's becoming less tied up with methamphetamine and other more dangerous drugs and more dangerous activity, other criminal and even violent activity. So the cannabis market, even when it isn't something that's being legally produced and sold, it's something that's less dirty, less bloody, has less violence associated with it. I think that's the process of, decriminalization associated with legalization, if that makes any sense. I don't know how that's going to evolve, but,
Totally agree. The methamphetamine market over here is huge. And we don't think necessarily that everyone's going to suddenly switch from meth to cannabis once cannabis is legalized. But over time, it will break the link for new cannabis users they won't, hopefully, are less likely to come in contact with methamphetamine until they're older.
There is good statistics coming around the world in places where it's more legal or easily accessible in terms of medicinal, where meth use has actually lowered when that market's popped up. So that's really good. I had a question on the live. Is there any policy within the bill for home growing?
Yes, yeah, we're quite pleased with that. So you're allowed for adults. An adult is considered over 20, and let's not get too much into the debate about the exact age limit because that's purely political. But if you're an adult over the age of 20, you can grow 2 plants per person, up to 4 plants per household. There's no limits. You don't have to get a license. There's no limits on the size of those plants. There's no limit on the THC levels of those plants. You can grow a small forest at home with your 4 plants, as long as you don't have more than 4. When the actual regulations are drafted, they will address things like seedlings and how big a plant has to be before it is considered a plant. Because there's little bits and pieces like that which have to be tidied up. This is only a draft bill. But the home grow provisions are what has attracted all of the medicinal cannabis users to support the referendum, because a lot of them want to be able to grow their own medicine at home. And so that's really good for them.
That's awesome.
I think there
Great
will
outcome.
be some sort of specialties with maybe separating vegetative plants versus flowering plants for people who have mother plants and things like that and are breeders. You know, if you're wanting this to develop, that's something that I think would be really, really powerful.
Yeah, and all of that stuff is what is debate that occurs at our select committee stage. So once we've won the referendum, the bill goes to select committee, and then that's where we submit on all the little bits and pieces and say, this is not quite right, this won't quite work, these things need changing. And we'll go through that process. So one of the things that people talk about is that the bill sets a limit of 15% THC. Yeah. And of course, all of the people growing cannabis in New Zealand say, oh, my weed's way stronger than that. And we're like, yeah, well, you've had it tested, have you? Yeah, sure, we believe you. Yeah, what your dealer tells you it's 22%, huh? Okay, whatever. So we kind of, 15%, 15% is not bad. Okay, 15% is actually pretty good. And that's actually only the commercial stuff anyway. If you think you can grow 22% THC in your back garden, yeah, go for it, but commercially there's a limit of 15. However, that's likely to change at select committee anyway, because even the police association is saying, how the hell will you enforce that? And that's pointless. That is counterintuitive, because if you're taking a health-based approach, then what you want is stronger THC, so you use less of it. You don't want, why would you be limiting it? Yeah, and the reason they put the limit on is purely political again, because the wowzers on the no side argue that the cannabis today is so much stronger than it was in the 1970s, as if it's heroin or something,
Right.
They actually, because they don't understand how cannabis is used, they think that strength equates to danger.
What's ironic is that they then introduce legal highs through, all of these prohibition kind of like laws, and then they have to ban those too, and they're even worse. And I feel like a lot of the misconceptions about cannabis come from spice and other related shit that people were on over the past 10 to 15 years. Basically the synthetic shit.
We see sometimes, we're moderating so many posts on our Facebook site. We get people coming to us and clearly they misunderstand cannabis to the extent that they think that people inject it. And stuff like that.
Hell.
And we actually sort of put out stuff explaining to people what cannabis is, that it's a plant. I quite often explain to people, think of it a bit like peppermint, like peppermint. I might have a cup of peppermint tea today because I have a sore tummy, and tomorrow I might have a cup of peppermint tea because I like the taste. Is it medicinal or is it recreational? How would you describe it? Now, what are you talking about peppermint for? And I says they're both herbs. Okay, they're both plants that you grow in your garden and use for different purposes. But that's the extent of the misinformation that we have out there, that people are thinking of heroin and talking about cannabis. It's
tragic.
Yeah, and it's kind of tragic that the policy-wise in the same schedule in a lot of ways. So
Yeah, yeah. Well, I actually remember a very long time ago when I had another policy job, and I was keeping an eye on a group in New Zealand called the Expert Advisory Committee on Drugs. They're a government organisation that advise the government on drug policy. And every now and again, they would review a drug to see if it was in the right schedule for classification. And I remember when they re-evaluated LSD, and to their horror, discovered that it didn't meet their criteria for a drug that should be scheduled at all, because they had this minimization criteria, and it was and following this criteria, you know, that was supposed to give them what classification it should be. And LSD didn't tick any of their criteria at all. And then they were faced with this thing of, if we follow our criteria, we'll have to deschedule LSD. And so the police rode into their rescue and said that it was a policing issue. And so they retained LSD as a Class A drug. But it's just the ridiculousness of it, that on a harm minimization approach, some of these drugs don't even get a mention. And alcohol should be Class A based on their harm minimization criteria.
Absolutely.
That vested interest group thing.
Comes down to that.
Is there any policy regarding concentrates and edibles and things like that?
So I didn't quite catch it.
Is there anything being talked about edibles and concentrates and things like that?
So at the moment, the bill sets out that that once the bill is adopted, it will initially only be for leaf, flower, and seed. And then a little later, they will introduce edibles, possibly concentrates, possibly that might be later again. Edibles, they'd have really strict regulations. Like edibles can't be anything that might be attractive to children, for example, because, you know, the no campaigns over here go on and on about gummy bears. It's quite ridiculous. They go on and on about 90% THC gummy bears. And, you know, being somebody who does actually, you know, like baking, I just keep thinking, how the hell do you make a 90% THC gummy bear? You know, it's kind of like you need gelatin in there and you need other substances. You know, you can't have it 90%. But side story. So yeah, the bill will initially just be leaf, flower, and seeds, and that is actually predominantly because it takes time to work out the regulations, to set up the marketing,
the labs
and
and
manufacturing, and the systems to allow edibles. So they will come in later.
Yeah,
you can still bake at home with the cannabis that you've grown at home.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah,
that's really good. Is there any limits to how much you can hold on your person?
Yeah, so you can only buy 14 grams a day. 14 grams per shop. So if you really wanted to buy more, you could just go to more than one shop, and they don't register.
You crawl around.
You know, there's no. You don't have to go in and sign and show, you know, ID. They don't sort of record it to make sure. So, you know, if you really wanted more, you could just go to 2 shops in one day. And there's also a limit of 14 grams on your person when you're out in public. So you can't use it in public, but they recognize that when you've bought it in the shop, you have to transport it to home. So you can be carrying that amount. There's no limit of how much you can have at home. So you can go out every day and buy 14 grams and get a big supply up if you really want to, you know, if you want to do that. Yeah. Or else you can harvest your crop of your 4 plants at home that you've managed to grow to be 12 feet tall, and you've got
8 pounds on each.
That's right. So if you've got homegrown, you can share that with friends and family, but you can't sell it. You can't trade it. You can give them for up to 14 grams to take away with them. That's all fine. It's very much like home brew. You know, you can make your own. You can share your own with your friends and family. But as soon as you start doing anything that looks like sale or trade, then, you know, you're in breach of actually the licensing regulations, where you sort of cross the line. So yeah, it's pretty good actually. They're all up. The conditions are pretty good for a first go at a bill. They've basically taken the Canadian bill. They've thrown in some things from what Portugal have done. Then they've talked to the officials in those countries and tidied up the things that the officials have said they would wish they'd done differently. And then they've amended it to make it more suitable for New Zealand's cultural environment, which includes a whole lot of aims and objectives around benefiting communities that have been disproportionately affected by the enforcement of the current law. So that's, you know, I've seen a lot of draft legislation in my time, and this one is actually pretty good for a draft legislation.
That's good. That's really good. Especially coming from a policy maker.
Yeah.
Do you know much about PGRs?
No, nothing. What are they?
Okay. So PGR
Here we
stands for
go.
Plant Growth Regulator, and that's been a big part of our campaign. So in Australia, we have a big problem because it's an illicit substance and gangs are trying to profit from it. They use PGRs to boost out the buds. So basically, it creates really shitty cannabis that's actually quite toxic and harmful. And it's actually pretty obvious when you look at it of what it is. And basically, it's a fertilizer of a sort. And we've built a campaign called Fuck PGR, trying to get it out of the community. And we've had a lot of success with it. I don't know if it's a big problem in New Zealand, because I've seen things out in New Zealand that are just phenomenal in terms of quality of cannabis. Like New Zealand is known for some of the best cannabis in the world. Is like the soils and the air in New Zealand, it does it all. But I do wonder if they have a PGR problem. But you've mentioned that you're not a cannabis user yourself, so I'm like, I don't think you would know.
No. Look, I would say part of, as a policy analyst, one of the areas I do work in is hazardous waste. So, like, I am quite aware that illicit growers do quite often use agricultural chemicals that are not quite right for the product, that are out of date, that are more harmful, that are sort of no longer in use. So there's, from that side of things, I'm aware of the fact that the illicit market is it's not particularly good from a hazardous waste point of view. There are a lot of growers here who take pride in the fact that they grow organic, and they're that's all fine. But I would assume that there are probably some people using sort of growth hormones and stimulators and things like that. I don't know if it's quite so much of a problem here.
Here in Australia, particularly in like Queensland, it's like paclobutrazole. It's like psycho, really, really, really nasty shit. It's just being thrown into the grow and completely affecting the genetic makeup. And I don't know, it's just weird.
Well, I assume it is being used here. If it's being used elsewhere, they'd probably be onto it somewhere. I just don't know if it's as big a problem.
I wonder if it's a commercial thing. That's the big thing. New Zealand has such a smaller population. It might be a little easier to service that population with good quality cannabis as opposed to how much the demand is here. So it could be a bit of that as well.
Yeah, we do just have naturally great growing conditions.
Yeah, that's true.
Amazing soil in New Zealand. And I think with that, we'll probably wrap up. We've been about an hour. Thanks to anyone who's tuned in. Check out the Make It Legal New Zealand page. Drop them a like and follow all along, because New Zealand's basically the gateway for Australia to get legalization to happen. So talk to your Kiwi friends, bro?
Yeah, and if I can do one last thing, this referendum's really, really close. So if we've got any people over in Australia who are able to vote in New Zealand, please go to Vote NZ, www.votenz, and enroll to vote and actually vote. We need your votes from Australia to win this referendum here in New Zealand. So please, if you're eligible to vote, vote.
There's a lot of deep generational divides in this election. Like the young people, 75% of them are willing to vote yes. And so this multi-generational stuff, it's really defining the outcomes. So if you're a New Zealand national, make sure to get out and vote, make sure to do your duty, and stand by this cause. It's an important thing to do for Australians, for New Zealanders, for the whole world at large.